Stalin's sledgehammer. The story of the 20th century's scariest hammer. You know that expression, bringing in the heavy artillery? In conversations, we often use it metaphorically when we want to talk about something weighty, indisputable, the final argument. But today, I want to talk about literal artillery. The kind that made the enemy's knees buckle just from the sight of it. The kind whose sound alone could rupture eardrums and collapse not just walls, but entire floors of reality. We're talking about the weapon the Finns nicknamed Stalin's sledgehammer, and our own soldiers called the Karelian sculptor. Interesting, right? A sculptor. Usually, sculptors work with marble or clay, creating beautiful things. This sculptor worked with pillboxes, tanks, and enemy personnel, turning them into a bizarre jumble of concrete, metal, and whatever used to be human. Harsh? Maybe. But that's the truth of war. This weapon went through the hell of the Finnish campaign, survived the nightmare of 1941, became a nightmare for the Germans at Kursk, and ended its combat journey in the era of atomic weapons. And today, walking through parks like Patriot Park or museums in Toljatti and Verkhnaya Pishma, we can see these giants and ask ourselves, how on earth did people actually control the steel colossus? How did they drag it through swamps and off-road terrain? And how did the Germans, seeing through their binoculars that this monster was firing directly at their Tiger tank, not instantly go gray? Let's figure it out step by step. Norrus. With feeling, sense, and order. Especially since the story of the B-4 isn't just dry lines of technical specifications, but a whole novel worthy of Leo Tolstoy or Stephen King, because in some parts it's pure horror for the enemy, of course. Chapter 1. Birth of a Monster. How the USSR created what Europe couldn't. To understand where this beast came from, we need to go back to the late 20s of the last century. Picture a young Soviet republic. All around is ruin, hunger, the country just starting to get back on its feet after the Civil War and foreign intervention. Industry was practically non-existent, experience in creating heavy weapons was next to nothing. And the enemies, they were right there. To the west, Poland, backed by the British and French. To the north, Finland, which was about to become a staging ground for an attack. To the east, the Japanese were already sharpening their claws. In this situation, the country's leadership and Comrade Stalin personally understood a simple thing. If a big war started, hiding behind strong walls wouldn't work. The war would be both maneuverable and positional. That meant they needed the means to push through any defense. They needed artillery of special power. The kind that could destroy a pillbox built to the latest French fortification standards with a single shell. In November 1920, a design bureau was established under the Artillery Committee. It was headed by Franz Franzovich Lender, a legendary man, the creator of the famous 3-inch gun, who had been designing artillery since Tsarist times. And this old, seasoned expert was given a task in 1926: develop a 203mm howitzer with great range. The deadlines were insane. Essentially, the country needed a weapon from scratch, in conditions where machine tools could be counted on one hand, and qualified engineers were even rarer. Lender took on the challenge. And here, it's important to understand what a challenge it was. 203mm is 8 inches. That's a battleship caliber. And to make a cannon out of that, one you could drag across fields and forests and fire with decent accuracy. Madness. But our grandfathers didn't look for easy paths. The project was ready by early 1928. Understanding that technologies could vary, Lender even developed 2 versions, one with a muzzle brake and one without. A muzzle brake is useful. It redirects some of the propellant gases backward, reducing recoil, but it also unmasks the gun with a cloud of dust and smoke. In the end, they chose the version without the brake, to make hiding this monster a bit easier. The first prototypes only appeared in 1931 at the Bolshevik plant in Leningrad. Mass production started in 1933, but the devil, as they say, is in the details. Production was launched simultaneously at 2 plants, in Leningrad and Stalingrad at the Barakati plant. And here began a classic Soviet industrial drama. In Leningrad, technology was a bit better. The plants had a long history. But in Stalingrad, the facilities weren't capable of making everything exactly to Lender's blueprints. The documentation had to be adjusted on the fly. By 1937, a surprising thing was discovered. Two practically different howitzers were being accepted into service. Both had the same index, B-4, but inside, everything was different. Can you imagine the confusion for repair crews and crews? Today, standardization is sacred. Back then, in the pre-war years, they had to improvise, creating unified drawings after the fact just to standardize the arsenal somehow. Nevertheless, by 1939, the process was streamlined. By 1942, despite the evacuation and loss of plants, 1,011 of these monsters had been produced. That's a colossal number, considering each howitzer weighed about 19 tons in traveling position. But why the track chassis specifically? Why not put it on wheels? Wheels are simpler, faster. Well, this is where things get interesting. The engineers perfectly understood. The gun's mass was enormous. The recoil was monstrous. When firing, ordinary wheels simply wouldn't withstand it. The gun would jump, throwing off the aim. But tracks, they sort of sucked the gun to the ground, absorbing the energy of the shot. Moreover, the tracked carriage allowed firing directly from the ground, without special platforms, which was critically important in forested and swampy terrain. Yes, the travel speed was glacial, tractors could barely drag this beast. But once it was in position, the enemy's end had come. Chapter 2. Baptism by Fire. Finland and the birth of the Karelian sculptor. The B-4's first real baptism by fire came during the Soviet-Finnish War of 1939 to 1940. This was a war often remembered negatively, talking about our huge losses and underestimation of the enemy. But from the perspective of artillery combat use, it was invaluable experience. The Finns built the famous Mannerheim Line. This wasn't just trenches and dugouts. It was a multi-kilometer belt of reinforced concrete fortifications, pillboxes that could withstand a direct hit from a standard field howitzer. Granite boulders, concrete caps 2 meters thick, armored cupolas. Our troops got bogged down, taking losses. So then, B-4 regiments were rushed to the front. About 150 guns. And what started was something the Finns would remember forever.
Imagine a granite pillbox.
It's dug into the earth, only the embrasures sticking out, spitting machine gun fire. You can't get close, you'd be mowed down. Smaller artillery just chips the concrete. Then, from a concealed position, a 100-kilogram suitcase comes flying. It doesn't just explode. It pierces the concrete like a hot knife through butter. The blast wave inside the pillbox wipes out everything living, the partitions, the ventilation. Our artillerymen quickly understood. This was the ideal weapon for destroying fortifications. That's when the B-4 got its first nickname, the Karelian sculptor. Why? Because after its work, the pillboxes were transformed into a shapeless mess of concrete, twisted rebar, and whatever remained of the garrison. The shell sculpted solid structures into something abstract and surreal. The Finns, to give them their due, quickly figured out what kind of beast this was. And it was they, not the Germans as is often mistakenly written, who gave the howitzer its second nickname, Stalin's Sledgehammer. Feel the difference. Sculptor is ours, internal, even with a touch of irony. But Sledgehammer, that comes from the enemy, from those this hammer hit. Heavy, inexorable, devastating. The Finns were the first to feel the blow of this heavy hammer. During that war, a telling incident occurred. One battery was firing on a Finnish convoy. Usually, howitzers fire at areas, but here the crews adjusted their aim so precisely that one shell literally wiped out a column of trucks carrying ammunition. Nothing was left of the convoy. This episode showed that with the right skill, the B-4 could work not only against stationary targets but also against moving ones, as long as you calculated the lead correctly. But the experience of the Finnish War also revealed problems. The main one was transportation. The tracks that provided stability horribly slowed down movement. The gun was towed separately, the barrel on a special barrel cart. It took several hours to move the B-4 from traveling to firing position. In a war of maneuver, this could be fatal. But for breaking through fortified regions, you couldn't ask for anything better. Chapter 3. 1941. Retreat and First Losses. The start of the Great Patriotic War was a shock. And although by June 1941, the troops already had over 800 B-4 howitzers, Their use in the first months was extremely difficult. Imagine the chaos of 1941. German tanks are breaking through the rear, communications are disrupted, enemy aircraft dominate the skies, and you have a 19-ton beast that needs to be hitched to a heavy Voroshilovets or Comintern tractor. Speed on the highway about 15 kilometers per hour, on dirt roads even less. German motorcyclists and tanks outflank the columns, and the artillerymen face a terrible choice: abandon their guns or die with them. From documents, we know there were cases of massive losses. The most famous episode was near Dubno in Ukraine. There, due to the rapid German advance, our units failed to evacuate 27 fully functional howitzers. They fell to the enemy. For us, it was a tragedy. For the Germans, it was a real gift. They captured guns that surpassed many of their own in caliber. The Germans quickly put the captured B-4s into service under the designation 20.3 centimeters Howitzer 503R, and they used them against us. But, strangely enough, this also had a positive effect. Our soldiers, seeing the enemy firing from our own guns, got an extra dose of fury. Besides, the Germans, for all their engineering talent, could never fully copy or improve the design. It was too specific, requiring that very Russian ingenuity and familiarity with off-road conditions. Despite the losses in 1941, B-4 production didn't just continue, it was increased. The Stalingrad Barricade plant worked like crazy. Even when the Germans approached the Volga, the machine tools kept turning parts for howitzers. And in 1942, when the plant ended up in the combat zone, production had to be scaled back, but the last 3 guns were still sent to the troops. Chapter 4. The Kursk Bulge. The shot that shook the world. The brightest, most legendary page in the B-4's biography is, without a doubt, the Battle of Kursk. Summer of 1943. After Stalingrad, our troops had seized the initiative, but the Germans were still very strong. They were preparing Operation Citadel, throwing their newest tanks into battle, the Tiger and the Panther. The frontal armor thickness of the Tiger was 100 millimeters. Our anti-tank guns, the 45mm ones affectionately dubbed Goodbye Motherland, could only penetrate that armor from the side and at close range. Now picture the Panayrai railway station, the northern face of the Kursk Bulge. Fierce battles raged here. The Germans were trying to break through our defenses, throwing in armored wedges. Among our artillery positions stood a battery of B-4s. According to regulations, howitzers were supposed to fire from concealed positions at areas at troop concentrations. Direct fire was nonsense, suicide. There were no proper sights for direct fire. Aiming was done through the barrel, which was extremely inaccurate. And getting such an expensive and heavy machine that close to the front line was madness. But war is always madness. The crew, commanded by Captain Vasilevsky, was firing at the advancing German infantry. Then suddenly, in a gap in the smoke, they saw it. A Tiger. It was heading straight for their positions, rolling over trenches, spitting fire. The distance was about 500 to 600 meters, maybe a little more. What did Captain Vasilevsky do? He could have ordered a retreat. He could have tried to hit the tank with indirect fire, useless, as the tank was moving. But he made a decision that historians would later call both genius and insane. Range 500 meters, direct fire, fire. The B-4 shell weighs about 100 kilograms. It leaves the barrel at over 500 meters per second. When it hit the Tiger, something happened that's hard to describe in words. Witnesses said, first came an impact that deafened even the artillerymen used to the roar. And when the smoke and dust cleared, the Tiger was gone. Not just on fire or overturned. It simply ceased to exist as an integral object. Later, when the fighting subsided, they went to look. The 57-ton tank was torn to pieces. For road wheels, a piece of track, the armored hull split in 2. That was it. The crew was gone. And the tank itself had been driven half a meter into the Kursk black soil by the impact. The shell hit it right in the front, between the hull and the turret, the very spot where even the Tiger's armor was slightly thinner. The blast wave and shrapnel also killed the infantry following the tank. In German documents, in a report from an officer named Klaus von Boswitz, if sources are to be believed, there is an entry. The Russians unleashed the power of their most powerful anti-tank gun upon us. Not a trace remained of the tank leading the column. The attack was halted. The funny thing is, the Germans never figured out what hit them so hard. They thought the Russians had developed some new secret superweapon. They couldn't even imagine it was a howitzer that, by all regulations, shouldn't have been firing directly. This case is the best illustration of what Stalin's sledgehammer was. It didn't just pierce armor. It annihilated matter. It sent the enemy into oblivion with no chance of survival. Chapter 5. Snipers with Howitzers, the Liberation of Europe. When the war rolled west and our troops entered Europe, the artillerymen faced a new challenge. Fortified regions were left behind, but urban battles began.
Warschau, Krakow, Königsberg, Berlin.
Every house was a fortress. In every window, a machine gun. In every attic, a Faustpatron soldier. And here the B-4 found a new purpose in the most unexpected way. Our artillerymen devised a tactic they called sniper howitzer fire. Picture an old European city. Narrow streets, thick walls. Germans holed up in a building, turning it into a strong point. Storming it with infantry would mean heavy losses. Calling in ground attack aircraft wasn't always possible due to weather or anti-aircraft defenses. Then, a B-4 rolls up. The crew doesn't aim at the wall. That would be too simple. They aim at the window, at the air vent, at the breach. The F-625D shell, weighing 100 kilograms, flies inside the building. What happens next? It explodes inside a confined space. The blast wave multiplies. Everyone inside is killed instantly. Often, the building simply collapses inward on itself. There's a documented case during the Vienna offensive. Our units were stalled before a block where SS soldiers were holed up. Machine gun nests pinned them down. The gun commander, whose name, unfortunately, isn't preserved in mass sources, but historians like Viktor Petrovsky confirm this episode, aimed and fired. The shell went straight into the embrasure, pierced several interior walls, and exploded deep inside the building. When our soldiers took the block, they counted about 100 dead SS soldiers. 100 men. With one shell. The gun commander was recommended for an award. Do you grasp the scale? An ordinary sniper might kill 10, 20, 30 enemies in a day. Here, 100 in a second. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a weapon of mass destruction on the scale of a single city block. By the 1st of May, 1945, there were so many of these howitzers in the active army that, as artillerymen joked, their firepower would have been enough to support an advance from the north to the south of Africa. 33 regiments armed with the B-4 fought their way from the walls of Moscow to Berlin. Chapter 6. The atomic finale, Sledgehammer with a nuclear core. The war ended. It seemed the era of giant-toed guns was fading into the past. The time of rockets and self-propelled guns had arrived. But the B-4 had a surprise in store. The weapon proved so successful in its ballistics and durability that it was a shame to scrap it. Then came the atomic age. In the 50s, the USSR was frantically searching for any means of delivering nuclear warheads. There were rockets, there were bombers, but artillery wasn't left out. Engineers asked, could the B-4 fire an atomic shell? It would mean colossal stress on the barrel, special ballistics, safety requirements. And they did it. A special nuclear projectile weighing about 150 kilograms was developed for the howitzer. The firing range remained decent, up to 20 kilometers. Imagine this apocalypse. The same old sledgehammer created back in Lender's day is sitting in position, and instead of a high-explosive shell, it sends an entire town, along with a tank division, to Kingdom Come. But there was a problem. The tracks. The old tractors could barely crawl. The speed was laughable. An atomic war requires mobility. So, in 1954 to 1955, designers led by G.I. Sergeyev at the Barakati plant made a real revolution. They created a new carriage for the B-4, a wheeled one. The weapon received the index B-4M. It was mounted on huge Gusmatics, sponge rubber tires that weren't afraid of bullets and shrapnel. Pneumatic brakes were installed. Most importantly, the barrel no longer needed to be removed for transport. It was simply pulled back. The time to move from traveling to firing position was reduced from hours to minutes. Now only one tractor was needed, not two, and the speed increased to 35 kilometers per hour. Thus, the old guard sledgehammer was transformed into a modern nuclear weapon. It remained in service until the mid-70s, when it was replaced by the legendary self-propelled gun, the 2S7 Pion, which, incidentally, inherited a lot from the B-4's development work. And even today, if World War III breaks out, some modifications of the B-4M are still technically in reserve as carriers of tactical nuclear weapons. Chapter 7. Economy and Home Front. The cost of one shot. Let's take a moment away from the romance of battle and talk about boring but important economics. Often, when we look at guns, we don't think about how much they cost, in rubles and in human effort. The B-4 was a bespoke weapon. Producing a single barrel required the highest qualification from steelworkers and turners. Let's look at the numbers. A total of 1,011 howitzers were produced. That might seem like a small number, but imagine, each one cost as much as a small tank factory. For instance, the Krasny Oktyabr or Barricade plants worked 3 shifts under bombing, hungry, cold, but they kept supplying these monsters to the front. The cost of one B-4 in 1939 was astronomical, on the order of several 100,000 rubles. And that's in pre-war prices. With that money, you could build several dozen apartment buildings or a school. But the state spared no expense, understanding it was better to spend on artillery now than to pay later with millions of soldiers' lives. Now, think about ammunition. The standard F625 high-explosive fragmentation shell weighed 100 kilograms. Loading the shell into the barrel required a special crane, because 15 crew members could physically shove it in manually, but they'd be exhausted after the 3rd shot. The rate of fire was a maximum of 1 round every 2 minutes. During a day of intense combat, a battery could throw tons of metal. The logistics of supplying such ammunition is a heroic story in itself. Imagine a column of trucks carrying these suitcases through the spring Rasputitsa, mud season. Roads are destroyed, bridges burned. If a truck got stuck, it would be shot from cannons because leaving such cargo for the enemy was unthinkable, and pulling it out was impossible. And all of the Soviet B-4 crew could fire a few dozen shells and destroy one pillbox. Chapter 8. Tigers and the Sledgehammer. Analysis of one hit. Let's go back to the Kursk Bulge and the incident with the Tiger. Many skeptics still argue. Did it really happen? Was it propaganda? Let's apply logic. The frontal armor thickness of the Tiger was 100 millimeters. But this armor wasn't monolithic in quality. The Germans were economizing on alloying elements by 1943, and it was placed at a right angle. The B-4 shell weighs 100 kilograms and has a muzzle velocity of about 500 meters per second. This kinetic energy is tens of megajoules. Even if the shell hadn't exploded, it would have simply rammed through the tank like a bullet through paper. But it did explode. The detonation of 100 kilograms of TNT or Amitol is a force for which the Tiger's armor is like a tin can to a sledgehammer. It doesn't just get penetrated, it tears apart. The hull splits along weld seams. The turret is ripped off and thrown tens of meters. There are photos online of a Tiger from the Kursk Bulge, supposedly used for testing against various weapons. You can see neat holes from armor-piercing shells. Our case wasn't a hole. It was a catastrophe. So when Captain Vasilevsky fired, he didn't see a disabled tank. He saw a pile of scrap metal. This, by the way, explains why the Germans couldn't believe a howitzer did it. They were looking for a crater from a super-heavy shell somewhere behind the tank. But the shell entered the tank and detonated inside. The German doctrine simply hadn't accounted for such a scenario. Chapter 9. Tactical Employment. From Karelian Sculptor to Berlin Hammer. It's interesting to trace how the tactics for using the B-4 evolved throughout the war. First period, 1939 to 1941, the weapon was seen exclusively as a means of destroying particularly strong fortifications. Firing was from concealed positions by map grid squares. Crews were tied to maps and diagrams. The target, pillboxes, bunkers, defensive nodes. Second period, 1942 to 1943, the beginning of its use in counter-battery fire and against mass tanks. Realizing the German defense was becoming echeloned, our generals started using the B-4 to disrupt tank attacks. A shell landing among tanks didn't necessarily have to hit a vehicle. The blast wave would flip them, concuss the crews, force the infantry to take cover. Third period, 1944 to 1945, the era of sniper fire and urban combat. Artillerymen learned to wheel the guns up for direct fire against buildings. It was dangerous because the B-4 was an excellent target. But the risk was worth it. One shot at a house, and the house turned into ruins under which the garrison perished. Battery commanders like Ivan Vedmedenko became legends, adjusting fire directly from the front lines or even from spotter aircraft. Speaking of Vedmedenko, there's a known case near Smolensk where our ground attack aircraft directed his battery's fire onto a large concentration of German tanks preparing for a counterattack. The B-4 strike thwarted this offensive before it could even assemble. The term target designation didn't exist yet, but our grandfathers were working precisely that way, ahead of the curve. Chapter 10. Where to see the legend today. If you're a fan of living history, like me, you have a unique opportunity to see a B-4 with your own eyes. Several examples are preserved in Russia, and standing next to them is a special feeling. One of the most famous locations is the Lenino-Snegiryovsky Military History Museum. It's located on the 41st kilometer of the Volokholamsk Highway, right where the fate of Moscow was decided in 1941. There's a B-4 standing there, and the guides tell details that will give you goosebumps. Another place is the Combat Glory of the Urals Museum in Verkhnaya Pishma, near Ekaterinburg. It's a fantastic museum, one of the best in the world. It houses hundreds of vehicles, including our heroine. They have both the early tracked version and the post-war wheeled B-4M. The legendary Howitzer is also in the Sakharov Technical Museum in Tolyatti. There, they stand side by side, the old tracked one and the new wheeled one. You can compare them. If you have the chance, definitely go and see it. It's not just a piece of metal. It's a piece of our history, our blood and sweat. When you stand next to this monster, you realize, yes, we won not only by numbers, but by skill. Because creating something like this, and more importantly, being able to use it in battle, that's priceless. Conclusion: why we must remember. My friends, we've run through the history of one gun. But really, it's the story of an entire era. The B-4 is a symbol of our engineering thought, our resilience, and our fury. Look at modern weapons, at self-propelled guns like the Pion or Malka. They are direct descendants of that same Sledgehammer. The idea planted by Lender and his team lives on today. Now, when the world is shaking again, when Nazism is raising its head once more, it's crucial to remember how hard-won our victory was. To remember that our grandfathers knew how to fight not only with shovels and rifles, but with the most advanced, most powerful weapons of their time. They didn't just kill. They destroyed the enemy's war machine. They turned tigers into piles of scrap and pillboxes into mass graves for their defenders. It seems to me that each of us must understand. Russia's strength isn't just in rockets and bombs. It's in this character, in the ability, at a critical moment, to wheel a 19-ton howitzer up for direct fire and blast it right in the enemy's face, without thinking about the manual. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, subscribe to the channel. I need to know you're with me, and be sure to leave a comment. What weapon of the Great Patriotic War do you consider the most legendary? Maybe you have your own family stories related to artillery? Share them. It's invaluable. In future episodes, we'll break down other pieces of equipment that forged the victory. It was awesome, powerful, and real. Thanks for reading this far. Remember history, be proud of it, and pass the truth on. Take care.